The Songs of Distant Earth, first published in If, June 1958, collected in The Other Side of the Sky.
Many years later, this became the basis for my own favorite novel, and A Beautiful Suite by Mike Oldfield. That's the Tubular Bells, Mike Oldfield.
Beneath the palm trees, Laura waited, watching the sea. Clyde's boat was already visible as a tiny notch on the far horizon, the only flaw in the perfect mating of sea and sky. Minute by minute it grew in size until it had detached itself from the featureless blue globe that encompassed the world. Now she could see Clyde standing at the prow, one hand twined around the rigging, statue still as his eyes sought her among the shadows. "Where are you, Laura?" his voice asked plaintively from the radio bracelet he had given her when they became engaged. "Come and help me. We've got a big catch to bring home." "So," Laura told herself, "that's why you asked me to hurry down to the beach?" Just to punish Clyde and to reduce him to the right state of anxiety, she ignored his call until he had repeated it half a dozen times. Even then she did not press the beautiful golden pearl set in the transmit button, but slowly emerged from the shade of the great trees and walked down the sloping beach. Clyde looked at her reproachfully but gave her a satisfactory kiss as soon as he had bounded ashore and secured the boat. Then they started unloading the catch together, scooping fish large and small from both hulls of the catamaran. Laura screwed up her nose but assisted gamely until the waiting sand sled was piled high with the victims of Clyde's skill. It was a good catch. When she married Clyde, Laura told herself proudly she'd never starve. The clumsy, armored creatures of this young planet's sea were not true fish. It would be 100 million years before nature invented scales here. But they were good enough eating, and the first colonists had labeled them with names they had brought with so many other traditions from unforgotten Earth. "That's the lot," grunted Clyde, tossing a fair imitation of a salmon onto the glistening heap. "I'll fix the nets later. Let's go." Finding a foothold with some difficulty, Laura jumped onto the sled behind him. The flexible rollers spun for a moment against the sand and then got a grip. Clyde, Laura, and 100 pounds of assorted fish started racing up the wave-scalloped beach. They had made half the brief journey when the simple, carefree world they had known all their young lives came suddenly to its end. The sign of its passing was written there upon the sky, as if a giant hand had drawn a piece of chalk across the blue vault of heaven. Even as Clyde and Laura watched, the gleaming vapor trail began to fray at its edges, breaking up into wisps of cloud. And now they could hear, falling down through the miles above their heads, a sound their world had not known for generations. Instinctively they grasped each other's hands as they stared at the snow-white furrow across the sky and listened to the thin scream from the borders of space. The descending ship had already vanished beyond the horizon before they turned to each other and breathed, almost with reverence, the same magic word. Earth! After 300 years of silence, the mother world had reached out once more to touch Thalassa. Why? Laura asked herself, when the long moment of revelation had passed and the scream of torn air ceased to echo from the sky. What had happened? After all these years, to bring a ship from mighty Earth to this quiet and contented world. There was no room for more colonists here on this one island in a watery planet, and Earth knew that well enough. Its robot survey ships had mapped and probed Thalassa from space 5 centuries ago, in the early days of interstellar exploration, long before man himself had ventured out into the gulfs between the stars. His electronic servants had gone ahead of him, circling the worlds of alien suns and heading homeward with their store of knowledge, as bees bring honey back to the parent hive. Such a scout had found Thalassa, a freak among worlds with its single large island in a shoreless sea. One day continents would be born here, but this was a new planet, its history still waiting to be written. The robot had taken 100 years to make its homeward journey, and for 100 more its garnered knowledge had slept in the electronic memories of the great computers which stored the wisdom of Earth. The first waves of colonization had not touched Thalassa. There were more profitable worlds to be developed, worlds that were not 9/10 water. Yet at last the pioneers had come. Only a dozen miles from where she was standing now, Laura's ancestors had first set foot upon this planet and claimed it for mankind. They had leveled hills, planted crops, moved rivers, built towns and factories, and multiplied until they reached the natural limits of their land. With its fertile soil, abundant seas, and mild, wholly predictable weather, Thalassa was not a world that demanded much of its adopted children. The pioneering spirit had lasted perhaps 2 generations. Thereafter the colonists were content to work as much as necessary, but no more, to dream nostalgically of Earth and to let the future look after itself. The village was seething with speculation when Clyde and Laura arrived. News had already come from the northern end of the island that the ship had spent its furious speed and was heading back at a low altitude, obviously looking for a place to land. "They'll still have the old maps," someone said. 10 to 1 they'll ground where the first expedition landed, up in the hills. It was a shrewd guess, and within minutes all available transport was moving out of the village, along the seldom-used road to the west. As befitted the mayor of so important a cultural center as Palm Bay, population 572, occupations fishing, hydroponics industries none, Laura's father led the way in his official car. The fact that its annual coat of paint was just about due was perhaps a little unfortunate. One could only hope that the visitors would overlook the occasional patches of bare metal. After all, the car itself was quite new. Laura could distinctly remember the excitement its arrival had caused only 13 years ago. The little caravan of assorted cars, trucks, and even a couple of straining sand sleds rolled over the crest of the hill and ground to a halt beside the weathered sign with its simple but impressive words. Landing site of the first expedition to Thalassa. 1 January, year 0. Parentheses, 28 May, AD 2626, closed parenthesis. The first expedition, Laura repeated silently. There had never been a second one. But here it was. The ship came in so low and so silently that it was almost upon them before they were aware of it. There was no sound of engines, only a brief rustling of leaves as the displaced air stirred among the trees. Then all was still once more. But it seemed to Laura that the shining ovoid resting on the turf was a great silver egg, waiting to hatch and to bring something new and strange into the peaceful world of Thalassa. "It's so small," someone whispered behind her. "They couldn't have come from Earth in that thing." "Of course not," the inevitable self-appointed expert replied at once. "That's only a lifeboat. The real ship's up there in space. Don't you remember that the first expedition—" "Shh!" someone else remonstrated. "They're coming out." It happened in the space of a single heartbeat. 1 second the seamless hull was so smooth and unbroken that the eye looked in vain for any sign of an opening, and then an instant later there was an oval doorway with a short ramp leading to the ground. Nothing had moved, but something had happened. How it had been done, Laura could not imagine. But she accepted the miracle without surprise. Such things were only to be expected of a ship that came from Earth. There were figures moving inside the shadowed entrance. Not a sound came from the waiting crowd as the visitors slowly emerged and stood blinking in the fierce light of an unfamiliar sun. There were 7 of them, all men, and they did not look in the least like the super beings she had expected. It was true they were all somewhat above the average in height and had thin, clear-cut features, but they were so pale that their skins were almost white. They seemed, moreover, worried and uncertain, which was something that puzzled Laura very much. For the first time it occurred to her that this landing on Thalassa might be unintentional, and that the visitors were as surprised to be here as the islanders were to greet them.